Hello, and thank you for joining us for the last installment of the Summer Energy Talk series organized by the UT Energy Institute. We have done 3 of those, and this is the 4th in line, and we are super excited to have an extraordinary discussion speaker thought leader with us. I'm Varun Rai. I'm director of the UT Energy Institute. We are delighted to have Peter Fox-Penner today with us for the conversation to talk about COVID-19's impact on energy and environmental perceptions, but we'll broach up other broader issues as well. So this should be a really fascinating discussion. Peter is the founding director of the Institute for Sustainable Energy at Boston University. He is a man who has done a lot. He has taught a lot, written a lot, and made a lot of impact. He is also a professor of practice at the Questrom School of Business, where his teaching and research focus on sustainable energy and electric power. Prior to joining Boston University, he served for over 2 decades as principal and chairman for the Brattle Group, who many of you know, have read about from. Before the Brattle Group, he served with the Department of Energy and the White House Office for Science and Technology Policy. In large part, this conversation is about a fascinating book that Peter has written called The Power After Carbon. And that's a sequel in many ways to a big, very important book that he wrote in 2010 that was Smart Power, Climate Change, the Smart Grid, and the Future of Electric Utilities. Deep decarbonization of the energy system by 2050 requires unprecedented rate and scale of change in the electric system infrastructure. In his new book, Power After Carbon, Peter argues that while small-scale decentralized energy generation has a role to play, it really will be the large-scale low-carbon or zero-carbon power generation and storage that will be indispensable. Go big and fast is a key part of what Peter's message is in this book. We'll try to unpack that and see what that all entails. In the next hour, we'll discuss with Peter what's necessary to achieve this rapid deployment, which is very important in many ways. What are some of the weakest linkages? How should we think about this? How should we prepare for it? And also how recent developments due to COVID-19 has changed the perception of investors, energy businesses, as well as policymakers in a way that could fundamentally alter the path of our energy transition in the US and more broadly. So thank you so much for joining us today. Peter, how are you?
Thank you, Varun. Thank you to everyone for joining us today. It's an honor to be before you, and a great pleasure to be with my colleagues at the UT Energy Institute, which I have known and worked with for many, many years. One of your former directors, Michael Weber, is an old friend and presented his book at my institute about 3 years ago. So turnabout is fair play, and it's wonderful to be here.
Totally, absolutely. Why don't I do this, Peter? Why don't you give us a quick tour of the big messages in your book, and that would set the stage for us to delve a little bit deeper and have a discussion.
Thank you. I'd love to. Let me see if I can share my screen with you. That should be it. That look okay to everybody?
Yeah, you're able to see that.
Great. Okay, so Varun mentioned the book is Power After Carbon, and the book really has 3 parts to it. The first part is about electricity's role in climate solutions, and there I argue that electricity plays a very, very central role. Well, I'll get a little bit into these in a very brief overview that I'll start in just a moment. The second part is about what I call the big grid, which is the part of the power grid outside the distribution system that is our local power grid. It's the transmission lines and generating plants and power markets like ERCOT, your market operator in Texas. And the second part's about that big grid. And then the third part talks about all the challenges to distribution utilities, the downstream grid, and that's where we're all connected to the downstream distribution grid That's what we think of as our utility or our retail provider. And that particular segment of the industry has very unique challenges of its own. And of course, the electricity system is the most interconnected and largest machine humanity has ever built. It must operate as a system and a machine in real time 24/7. So it operates and must be planned and built under very, very extraordinary conditions, much more stringent than any other infrastructure we have, including the internet. So with that, let me see if I can get this thing to advance. There we go. Part one of the book is about electricity's role in a climate solution, and it's very central. In the developed world, I think there is a very strong consensus that the only pathway, broad pathway towards a climate solution, and it has many variations on it, but it also has these anchor pillars. One of them is accelerating energy efficiency, because that just frees up clean energy for the rest of the world, which really, really needs it, the rest of our economy. So you have to do as much energy efficiency as you can manage. You also have to electrify much of the fossil using end uses. And starting with transportation, which is furthest along, you probably saw just an announcement that Republic, a very large refuse disposal company, just ordered 50,000, I think, electric garbage trucks, transitioning from natural gas, which was already a transition from diesel trucks. Electric transportation is starting to happen. I think it will happen. And I think it's very, very important way to back out fossil fuels. Then there's electrifying building heat. That's also moved, not as quickly. It's 70% of all of the energy use in the country is associated with buildings. So we need to basically take out the gas and oil that we use to heat those buildings or decarbonize it some other way. And finally, I think electrification of industry is important, because many industrial processes can be electrified. It adds an enormous amount of efficiency, increases environmental justice, because we know that fence line communities around industrial facilities are the most exposed to environmental toxins. So it really helps on racial justice. And by the way, electrifying heat does too. But when you add up all those elements of a climate solution, you're going to need a power system large enough to supply all that electric usage, and also to continue to supply all the electricity we need, about 3,900 terawatt hours a year, just from current uses, without electrified transportation, almost no electrified heat, very little electrified industrial processes. So we're going to need significantly more power, and it has to come from no carbon sources. It has to maintain high reliability and resilience. No industrial economy, no society in this day and age can exist without reliable power. We know what it's like to have outages and go crazy when we can't use the internet and watch our food spoil. So we need to have high reliability and resilience against weather events that are getting stronger and stronger and more damaging to the power grid. And of course, we have to keep affordability and fairness in our electric system. Electricity is one of the cheapest infrastructure services, far below the cost of housing and medical care in the United States. The smallest share of the wallet it's had in 30 years, but it needs to stay that way. And that's very, very important. And I very much believe can be done. So that's the first third of the book. It's all about the fact that we're going to need a large power system. And you might say, how much larger? I think it's going to be somewhere between at least 40% larger by 2050, and could be as large as double, maybe even more. But somewhere in that range, with lots of uncertainties over how much hydrogen will emerge, how long we'll keep natural gas and even oil around. I think coal will be long gone before 2050 in the United States. and most of Europe, if not all, and the rest of the OECD, I think. But there's questions about this, but I think that range is very solid. It may sound like an enormous range, but within that range, you can read about it in the book. I think it is very, very achievable for the industry to grow at somewhere between 2 and 4% a year. And it's just that difference in annual growth rates that gets you between those two boundaries of additions. So I really want to respect the format of the UT Austin seminar series and not give the normal presentation of the book, which goes on for quite some minutes. So I'm really going to summarize the rest of the book by using the summary slide I usually use, and it'll just step you through the main points. And the first two I've already done. And energy efficiency as a policy should be maximized. You know what I say, this takes real work. You can read about it in the book, but there's quite a lot of literature that's very careful and very thoughtful and shows that the energy efficiency potential of the US economy is far above what we're achieving. Even the cost effective, that is, the energy efficiency that will pay for itself at a reasonable cost of capital or discount rate. There's a lot of that on the table, and we have pretty much flattened our energy use to zero growth over the last 10 years because we have used energy efficiency wisely. And that's both price-driven and policy-driven, or that you might say economics or self-interest-driven and policy-driven energy efficiency. But to go beyond that and really put a dent in that 40% to 200% to 100% increase in our energy use, we will have to work a lot harder than we're working. Some of the energy plans that have been proposed by some of the candidates in the cycle and the House have that greater ambition. They can bring that growth down, but I don't think it will be brought down to the point where the big grid doesn't need to grow significantly. That leaves the second point, which I think I mentioned. Well, I think we will need, and we will be able to pull off a clean power industry, perhaps 50% larger than we have today, and I think it's very doable. I mentioned the big grid intentionally early on. The big grid, which is the large power plants and the transmission lines, it's doing okay. It's doing okay in Texas, and it's doing okay around the rest of the developed world, but it's not doing great. It has a lot of problems. We're not building storage, large-scale storage, as fast as we need to. And by storage, I don't mean storage that stores energy for 4 hours, like the Powerwall you can buy for your basement, or much of the storage being added today. We need seasonal terawatt scale storage on the order of hydroelectric dams, like Hydro-Quebec's dams hold 164 terawatt hours of storage. That's enough to power a region or a sub-region across a dark, cold winter with the ups and downs of wind and solar. And that's the scale of storage we're going to need. I also think we're going to need regional planning, regional energy planning that includes hydrogen and other decarbonized sources. I should mention something important, and that is, I do not think electricity alone is the solution. I hope my first slide didn't leave you with that impression. It doesn't say that if you read the bar at the bottom. We will, I think, be using hydrogen substantially, perhaps some of it or even much of it made from electricity, but nonetheless, I think we will be using it. And we will be using other decarbonized fuels, and we may very well be using natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration. There are 21 sequestration facilities in operation today in the world already, 60, I think, in the planning stages. So back to decarbonized big grids, we'll need regional planning, as I mentioned, and I think we need power market reforms. Any of you who are involved in the Texas power markets know that debates over reforming the Texas markets have been heated and have been going on for years. That's true in every power market in the world. And there's general consensus that the old products of energy and capacity which are the two products that are universally sold in power markets around the world, have to be unpacked into much more sophisticated ancillary service and reactive power products and so on, including flexible load and many other things. And that work is underway, but it's slow going, and it needs a lot of care and attention. I mentioned the downstream sector of distribution systems. Those distribution systems are everywhere in the world, regulated by regulators because they're natural monopolies, or they're publicly owned and therefore owned and operated in the public interest, is roughly the equivalent. Those sectors are changing dramatically from passive analog systems that simply deliver electricity from the big grid down to every home and office, a one-way flow, a one-way radial network, for those of you who are engineers, of wires and transformers and switches and not much else, changing into what we often casually call the smart grid. That's a multi-directional grid where there's millions of small power generating facilities. Today, almost all rooftop solar, but perhaps some fuel cells. There are a few fuel cells now, and there will be more, and maybe small wind and geothermal and so on and so forth. Millions of small scale generators interchanging power with each other, sending power what would be normally considered backwards up to the large scale power grid, adjusting loads, smart controls of homes and things like that. And because that's the grid that utilities must manage and keep reliable and keep balanced, they need much more sophisticated control technology, and they are installing it bit by bit, but it takes money and experimentation and new technologies. And it also takes a new regulatory model, because their objective now is not to sell as many kilowatt hours as possible, which is what our original regulation was built on. It really needs to be performance-based regulation where they're incentivized to do a good job of managing and optimizing this network. And that means using prices and market signals at retail, much more sophisticated than the ones we have. Dynamic pricing or time-dependent pricing is critical, and lots of other tools. Finally, I want to give just a recognition to the fact that we generally think of the power industry as ending at the customer's doorstep or the meter coming into the structure, because electrification of transportation and electrification of industry and electrification of heating and other end uses is so important. We need to recognize that as just as an important part of creating a clean grid and creating a climate policy as anything. So cost-effective electrification of these sectors is every bit as important, or more so, than building more wind and solar facilities. And there are a number of new organizations and traditional organizations like the Edison Electric Institute that are doing more and more work on this. You can read about them in the book and on some other slide decks and shows. And just to conclude, this is an exciting project. Decarbonizing the grid is an enormous challenge, but it's one that we can take on. It's one that will take some time. It will take some serious capital, and it will take a lot of entrepreneurial efforts, research and development, wise government policies, and changes in wise government policies. But the good news is that I really and truly believe it's really doable. So with that, Varun, back to you. We'll look forward to our conversation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Peter. If you could stop sharing the screen.
Oh,
so
good idea.
Highlighted. And then I'll remind the audience, please continue to type your questions in the Q&A chat box. We are collecting questions as we are going along, and we'll come to all of that towards the very end. So thank you again, Peter. This is fascinating, such a great vision. And as you mentioned, there are the three elements of energy efficiency and electrification and clean fuels, or fuel switching. These certainly have emerged as the three main pillars of many of the main pathways that have been proposed. Let me take you and get your thoughts on three different aspects. And the first one of that is achieving this 50% to 100% increase in the size of the infrastructure that you mentioned over the next 30 years or so, and you mentioned a 2 to 4% growth rate year on year, please put that in perspective for us, right? In the past, how has that looked? How has that looked in the last 15, 20 years? And then what does that really mean for us, year on year over the next 30 years?
Right. Excellent question, Varun. And let me answer it partly with a story about my very first engineering class, which was Engineering 100 at the University of Illinois Electrical Engineering School. And my professor happened to be actually a physicist. And he was, like many early environmentalists of the era, obsessed with exponential growth. And the very first thing he taught me is that 7% average annual growth rates means you double every 10 years. To basically a hippie politics major, those numbers sounded crazy, like 7% growth a year and you double every 10 years. But it's true. And in those days, this was the early 70s, the electricity industry had gone through not just a few years, but 2 decades of growing at 7% a year. So it had gone through 2 doublings in 2 decades. So when I say that we need to grow 50% to 100% in 20 years, that's half the pace of the heyday of the electric industry. Now, the industry was growing in those days by adding very large coal plants principally, and some nuclear plants. Gas plants were not even really very common in those days. But if you look at the current pace of additions of solar and wind, 20 gigawatts of solar predicted this year, 10 of wind, you need to increase, and you just rely on them, not counting gas with CCS, advanced nuclear, geothermal, and other sources that I think we will have. We already have some of them. You need about a factor of 6 increase, 3 to 6 above our current pace of growth. I think that's very doable if we put our minds to it.
We'll have a chance to come back to that, Peter. Thank you. The second strand I want to open up is more on the regulation side of things. You mentioned the need for new types of business models and different types of incentives. You mentioned a few examples in terms of dynamic pricing and so on. What we have seen in the last 10, 20, 30 years, there are lots of great experiments, and there are utilities and regulators who have actually put some of this in place. And yet, things which make absolute simple sense in terms of let's go ahead and do that, take years and decades. And sometimes, once you do an experiment, because of complexities, those get rolled back. And given the fundamental value you put in terms of what's needed in terms of, incentives and programs and regulation, help us think about that. What really is needed in terms of the regulation, and what is a good practical, because in your many hats that you have wore, you have interacted quite a bit with the regulatory system, right? So what are those practical pathways through which this can be achieved, given what we have learned in the last 20 years or so?
It differs on the federal and state level here in the US, where we have this split jurisdiction, Arun, between the distribution grid regulated by the states or publicly owned, usually locally owned. And then we have the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission at the federal level. Starting with the federal level, we need very substantial changes there. First of all, our federal energy policy is about as backwards as it could be, and we need a vastly revamped federal energy policy, like one of the presidential candidates or the House Select Climate Crisis Committee. And as part of that, as I mentioned earlier in my talk, I think we need to change federal energy regulation to include a mandatory planning function, and also some change rules about how we build transmission and allocate the cost of transmission, including planning for distributed generation and maximized energy efficiency, and sort of figuring the large-scale resources needed as the residual of what we can't get at the local level. But as I mentioned, I think that residual will be quite substantial. So this will take, I think, federal legislation to change federal energy planning, federal energy policy, and the role of the Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. Right now, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has no mandate to advance the climate policy. It has a very, very narrow mandate stemming from the 1930s to regulate only a few aspects of the national power system, and very limited authority in that area. So it has to change its mandate. And then I think up until recently, it has been within its mandate, just as fantastically thoughtful and effective agency. We have it to thank largely for creating power markets and doing a reasonably good job. We had a giant down in California. Some of you might have been involved in it. I was on a case for years and years on it, but overall, we have created energy and capacity markets, and the FERC has governed them now well, quite well. So that's the federal level. Sorry to be so long, Varun. I'll try to do the state level quickly. The book has quite a bit about the changes needed at the state level, but there we're fortunate to live in the laboratory of democracy. We have 49 different state public service commissions. There's none in Nebraska, but beyond them, we have almost 1,000 rural electric cooperatives that are quite creative, and almost 3,000 municipal utilities, many of which are very, very advanced and leading in clean energy implementation. So we have lots of examples of experimentation and progress going on, Varun. And when I wrote Smart Power in 2010, I honestly could not have imagined the state public service commissions and the co-ops and the municipal utilities being as far along as they are in understanding the importance of changing the system to climate change, understanding the importance of distributed energy and energy efficiency, and the changing role of the utility. So the understanding has gone faster than I could have dreamed. What's needed is very, I don't want to call it technical, but it's spade work. It's incremental improvements, one at a time, experimentation, creating this performance-based regulatory regime, incentivizing utilities to do things that they haven't done before. And I think they're interested in doing it. So that's not a very good answer, but it's really hard to crystallize the one thing that they have to do, other than to say that they need to create these performance incentives to incentivize utilities to add solar quickly, distributed solar in their system quickly, to manage their systems well, to add in self-healing grid technologies, to create markets and programs to allow customers to adjust their loads, that is flexible load, and to sell it. They need to create markets and programs and policies that advance all of those smart grid related features.
That's great to hear, Peter. Such a good way to think about it, and keep in mind the progress that has been made. The task ahead is not easy, but there is basis to believe we can continue on that path forward. So a great way to think about this, Peter. One final thing I want to broach up, and there are other questions, but final thing from you based off of initial remarks is on transmission infrastructure. As you as we think about, increasing the capacity by 50% to 100%, and decarbonizing much of that generation, right? So building a lot more, solar, wind, and other low carbon electricity generation, transmission will be needed. So help us think about transmission. And as we try to move this generation from where they are generated to demand centers, certainly we'll need new transmission infrastructure. And share with us a little bit, what the recent 5-10 years experience has been. Do you think that could be a bottleneck as we try to grow rapidly? And if not, what gives you that belief that will not be a problem?
Well, I think it is a bit of a bottleneck. I don't think it's fatal, but what I think it is doing is slowing us down, which is not good, and causing us to spend more on the decarbonization mission than we need to spend by not accessing some of the cheaper resources that we could get offshore and in the wind and solar belts in the US and similarly around the world. The US, if you really benchmark us against all the other developed OECD countries, we're worst in transmission building. And let me emphasize that I'm not for transmission building just for the sake of it. I probably think that we need less transmission than almost all of my peers who look at the big picture, because I see transmission as the residual that you can't get locally. But I also did a benchmarking for the book. I've talked to many experts around the world, and we're really slowest and worst at accessing low-cost resources. We're getting a little bit better. We're finally starting to tap offshore wind and bring the learning curve down. That's why I call for a really significant change in transmission planning, which we now do on it's almost a voluntary basis. Certainly interregionally, it's largely voluntary within Order 1000 and FERC. Let me also say, Varun, that I took a hard look in the book at the idea of a DC supergrid that some people like to talk to, building extra high voltage DC high capacity power lines from coast to coast, and a kind of a network of them that could be in some sense analogous to the interstate highway system or the internet, really create much more optionality for sending large amounts of carbon-free power around the country. I think that's a fantastic vision, and I think as a matter of engineering, we can pull it off and the economics are getting better. But I'm not convinced that it's absolutely necessary to do it as a moonshot scale all at once project. I think, and I think the United States is not well suited to that. It may be in the near future when in reaction to the pandemic and the economic crisis that we're in, there is a boldness in federal action that would be extraordinary. And I hope there is. But I think it would take just an incredible political consensus at the national level, much stronger than anything I could foresee, to do that entire coast-to-coast system. What my proposal will I hope achieve is that parts of that DC supergrid, I believe, would be planned, built, and be very cost effective and very helpful. And it could be over time that we end up with a DC supergrid. It would not surprise me, but we'll do it incrementally, just as we did our grid itself, Arun. If you remember, President Roosevelt or any of his peers of that era didn't sit down and say, we're going to build a transmission system from coast to coast starting now. The railroads didn't sit down in their era and say, we're going to build the entire system coast to coast. They built it incrementally, and then they spent a lot of time on one transcontinental link, and eventually we have the system we have. I think it will evolve more that way.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Again, a reminder to the audience to please keep typing your questions into the Q&A box. Let me shift gears a little bit, Peter, and talk about the current day and times we are living in through the COVID-19 pandemic. You also have, in many of the amazing thing about you, Peter, is you really have an amazing breadth of experiences, including being an investor. And so tell us a little bit, how, given what we just have seen in terms of shock to, dramatic shock to demand, also, things, very, very interesting and big things happening on the supply side. I'm talking about obviously the international oil markets. And what signals do these experiences send to investors and in relevance to the infrastructure and investment build we are looking to, the 2 to 4% year-on-year growth we are looking over the next 30 years? How do these experiences of today's world shape how our investors are going to think about this? Because eventually, investors are the ones who will have to be putting the resources to build this. And so how is that going to get shaped?
Well, first of all, I think investors who are looking at the long run recognize that climate change is an existential threat, not only to our health and safety and society, but also to the economy. And that it's not going away, that this pandemic, like all pandemics, will pass, and climate change will not cure itself. We will not find a vaccine for it. We can't send it to the emergency room, as some of my friends like to say. So that the clean energy investment long-term mission remains the same. And the second thing along those kind of high-level, lofty kind of conceptual lines is that this pandemic has emphasized to many, many people, the broad public at large, I think worldwide, the importance of dealing with climate change. It's emphasized the importance, and that's because there's a similarity and a resonance between the pandemic and the damage that climate change is doing to us and will do. In both cases, we're talking about global threats, and in both cases, they're really intangible, invisible threats, but dangerous and far-reaching and almost impossible to wall off from each other. They are truly shared global problems. And I think even for me, who works on this day in and day out over the last 20 years, the pandemic has really, really brought home the importance of government policies to create systems that protect us from shared global threats and to take action proactively instead of having to wait for the worst and try and play catch up. And as we experience all of that every day when we open the newspaper or turn on the radio and hear about the pandemic and realize that science is really true, scientists are in good faith saying we must act now, it's really resonating. So investors are recognizing that. And if you look at the broad arc of clean energy investing, it is not slowing down at a significant level. There are certain pockets of the clean energy industry that have really been hurt short term. And their investments are down and sales are down. Residential solar came down because installers couldn't go into houses. But at Energy Impact Partners, we have been reassured by the continued interest in our sector. We're continuing to do investments at EIP, and our peers are continuing to invest, including some very, very large infrastructure announcements. And next thing I want to say, Varun, is that because we are going to need a massive economic program to dig out of this economic hole we're in, the mission, the investment mission of creating a clean energy system is tailor-made for that because it's a gigantic job creator. That's been very, very well demonstrated. And so if we use this moment to accelerate our investment in all forms of electric infrastructure, those decarbonization pillars that I talked about that are going to take a lot of capital, but when you invest capital, you always create jobs. That's just in these particular electrification pillars, not counting the grid itself, not counting creating 100 million smart homes that we need. So there's a gigantic economic rebuilding opportunity that's the silver lining in this terribly dark pandemic cloud. Let me stop with those high-level points. There are many more, if you'd like to talk more, there are many more specific shifts analogous to the particular sectors that are being hurt by the pandemic long-term and the shifts in our work styles and lifestyles. Those are going to trigger changes in the energy system. But in terms of are we still going to need a 40 to 100% larger grid in 2035 to 2050, Varun? This pandemic aside, absolutely.
Yeah, that's terrific. Peter, one final question before we turn to the audience. This gets back to kind of, some of the core theme here, which is really ramping up electrification as, there are three pillars, but within that, certainly electrification as being a very, very central and important goal. And there has been some recent discussion, debate in the researcher analyst community that, let's just singularly focus on electrification for the next 10, 20, 30 years. All the other interesting things like CCS and hydrogen and so on, those are good, but distractions. What's your take on that, Peter? Should we, just go full in and electrify, which certainly parts of that are great, but at the neglect of other options which could really help us have diverse set of choices in case we hit big roadblocks?
Well, I don't think we should focus exclusively on electrification. I think we should focus very, very much and very hard on it. And it should be what I would call, for lack of a better term, the primary pathway, because we know we're going to need a clean power grid. We need one now. We know that we're going to electrify some substantial part of transportation. That die is largely cast. And also heating is coming along. So much of this, it's only a question of degree, and we need to get it done, and we need to get it done right. Should we be putting all our eggs in that basket? No, absolutely not. I think hydrogen's going to play a significant role. That's my own personal view. There's more and more business activity around hydrogen. Amazon's using it for its data centers. NextEra just announced a green hydrogen electrolyzer. Morgan Stanley has a very good report out on green hydrogen, if any of you are interested in it. And it shows that actually their prediction is that green hydrogen, that is hydrogen generated electrolytically from electricity and water with zero carbon, will be competitive with hydrogen, so-called blue or brown hydrogen, by 2025. That's amazing. And it could be that even if they're off by a few years, that's substantial. I also think that biofuels are going to play a role. Renewable natural gas can be actually, in some instances, carbon negative. You probably know that, depending on where it's gotten and how it's treated. And so that's important. I think we're going to need to remove some carbon from the atmosphere, and that's direct air capture. That, by the way, may be a new demand on electricity, because much of that will probably run electrically. And I think we're going to continue to use natural gas, and I think work on carbon sequestration is very appropriate. I think it will come to bear elsewhere in the world. Geothermal power, I don't know if you call it electric. I think that's important. So all eggs in one basket, no. A strong push on electrification, primarily yes.
Great. Awesome, Peter. Thank you so much. So we have about 15 minutes or so for Q&A. We have lots of questions. And the way we'll do this is, Peter, Dave Tuttle will read the questions directly to you. And so please do not wait for me. Just go ahead and answer those questions. So Dave, over to you.
Sure, thanks. Peter, there's so many great questions. I'll have to combine and summarize some of them. The first one I tried to combine was utility scale storage. So where do you see the different technologies, storage technologies best fitting? You mentioned hydrogen. We see batteries getting lower and lower cost, thermal, there could be gravity-based. So is there a simple framework that you look at for where those different technologies best fit?
Well, the answer is I don't have what I think of as a simple answer. I think the questioner is right. Solar is getting paired with storage more and more and more. It's almost becoming the norm. Fortunately, I think the storage options are starting to expand. Until just this year, I would say lithium ion was the only storage I really ever heard in commercial use paired with solar. There's now, I just mentioned that NextEra has announced, I think it's about a 15 or 20 megawatt electrolyzer to make hydrogen, which is a form of storage, a very good one. And it's making it right pretty much at the solar facility. I think that will be a couple of years off, but not far. I just for fair disclosure, I'm an advisor to EOS Energy Storage, which is zinc air utility scale storage. There's quite a large backlog of order for this particular non-lithium ion technology. And there's lots of people working to move beyond lithium ion. David Hart at ITIF has a very good paper called Beyond Lithium, if you're interested in that. So I think the pairing storage with solar is going to become very common. I don't have a simple framework for it other than to say the technology options are increasing. And one other thing I'll say about my framework, if I could call it that, is I may be wrong, but I don't see pairing solar and storage as the only place storage is going to be. I think there is going to be a large market for storage beyond on-site pairing. And so we need to think about storage by itself, that is, as a, you might almost say a sector of the industry by itself.
Well, that's a good lead into the next question.
Thank you for good question.
Next question, really related, is the regulatory framework for storage. So what needs to change to enable non-wires alternatives, or to improve the economics from, say, value stacking, or to enable storage as a service?
Yes. Well, the questioner's got the right lingo and the right way to think about it. At the federal level, I mentioned the markets that we created were great in the 1990s, when the only products we ever thought about were capacity and energy. And even the capacity markets have worked, reasonably well, but always under evolution. We need to disaggregate the products, much like Order 841 started the work for storage. So we need a disaggregated set of wholesale products at the federal level. And then I think markets will improve for storage. And everyone needs to be able to access those markets on fair terms. That is, you need to be able to aggregate up from the distribution system and sell in the large scale markets. But that has to be done in a fair, unsubsidized, manageable way that doesn't hurt the ability to manage the distribution system. That's a technical challenge, as well as a cost sharing and regulatory challenge. And that will take the cooperation of the stakeholders and the regulators at the distribution level and the state level much like we had to go through for Order 841.
So that leads into
at the distribution level. I just mentioned at the distribution level, we need the same creation of markets. I'm not so sanguine about the fact that we can snap our fingers and monetize every every element of value that batteries on the distribution system create. I think there is a very significant value stack. It needs to be disaggregated and it needs to be monetized, but I'd like to say that it's not clear that it can always be done by creating competitive markets. Competitive markets are a challenge to create. Any of you who've worked on them can see that. You need lots of conditions for that. And that may mean that the utilities have to be the counterparties for these markets. And that includes non-wires alternatives, where you don't really have, the only buyer of a non-wire alternative is the utility that has the obligation to put in the wire. That's appropriate. And all utility distribution planning processes should now evolve to work in that way and include that particular contribution to storage value.
Dave,
thank you.
Dave, before you ask the next question, maybe see if your mic placement is right. We are having a little difficulty hearing you.
Okay, so that leads into a quick discussion or answer about DSOs, distribution system operators, and transactive energy. Do you see any sweet spot on that?
I don't know if I'd call it a sweet spot, but if I could digress a moment into the distribution utility business models that any of you read Smart Power or have seen any of my talks have gotten to know. The spectrum is DSOs, which are independent operators of the distribution system with passive grid owners. Then there are what you would call smart integrators or platform utilities. That was the original REV vision and the EU vision, and those are transactive energy markets, but the utility also serves as a DSO. Then there's, at the other end of the spectrum, what I call energy service utilities, which are utilities that really integrate the provision of services. They work with the marketplace. They often leverage the marketplace, but they view themselves as the integrated providers of energy services, not just kilowatt hours and not just kilowatt hour delivery. And then there's hybrids in between the integrated model and the platform utility. And I will say that I see movement along all of those business models. I see the least in creating pure DSOs, and I'm not a fan of pure DSOs and passive utilities, because I think utilities have a very important role to play as an integrated provider. I kind of foreshadowed that in my talk about value stacking in the distribution system. But all in an attempt to get to the questioner's use of the term sweet spot. While I see progress in every area, if I had to guess from my lousy crystal ball, I think things are converging on kind of a hybrid, not a pure transactive platform utility, not a pure energy service utility, but sort of a pragmatic, whatever, blend of those things. And I wouldn't have predicted that. I thought the smart integrator would dominate. I think I said that and gave it those odds, but vertical integration is still very, very important. And part of that has to do with, I think, climate policy and the need to accelerate change faster. And utilities, believe it or not, I think are instrumental and critical in being able to scale new technologies quickly. I think that's, we've demonstrated that many times. And so leveraging that is important, and policymakers and regulators understand that. They're also important at making the benefits of clean energy change universally available. And so they're very important for economic and climate justice, and they're a great instrument for that. So as that increases in importance, in my view, this is tilting the preferred model, at least for the moment, away from the DSO and even the pure platform utility towards the hybrid.
Excellent, thank you. The role of natural gas through, say, 2050 or the transition.
Oh, that's hard. There's going to be one, but it as a directly combusted fuel without carbon capture and sequestration, it's going to have to ramp down. And I think there's a pretty widespread agreement that it will ramp down where it can't be decarbonized. Exactly how fast that happens is very, very much a function of national climate policy. I think that's many states, I think, will be able to make progress, but we'll need a national climate policy to do it for the whole country. As I said, I believe personally that carbon capture and sequestration, large-scale carbon capture and sequestration for natural gas power is going to play a significant role. I mentioned that I think there's 21 operating facilities now today in the US and in the world. And so I think gas will play a role there. And I think gas utilities by 2050 will be much, just as electric utilities have had to become much more sophisticated and complicated network operators. I wouldn't be surprised if they're operating hydrogen networks, maybe some other decarbonized gas, maybe separate renewable natural gas networks, and maybe gas networks that go to capture facilities. Something much more variegated than a one-size-fits-all natural gas network that we have today.
Okay, thank you. Political, popular, international support. So do you see a significant change in public or in the US political support for making some of these actions for the transition? And do you see, importantly, the international community in other countries moving forward too? So it's not just the US or the Western countries spending a lot of effort on this and it's swamped by, say, emerging market emissions.
Well, let me do emerging. Well, let me start at the beginning. I do see, as I mentioned earlier in my answer to Varun about people's reaction to the pandemic, I think there is a strengthening of resolve in the American public and a strengthening of interest in climate solutions. And it comes both from that resonance and the similarities between the pandemic and the threat from global climate change, and the recognition that this creates a perfect opportunity to attack that problem with job creation programs and investments that will really boost the economy, much as FDR did with the Civilian Conservation Corps and the WPA in the 1930s. The moniker "Build Back Better" is kind of the battle cry of that movement. So I think there's a strengthening. I think you see that in public opinion, clearly in the polling, and you see it in the presidential election. Many of you remember in the last presidential election cycle, during the many, many debates that were held, climate change, there was not a single question on climate change. I've watched most of the debates. I don't think there was a single question without climate change in it. You know, one candidate has released the most extensive climate and ambitious and bold climate policy any presidential candidates ever issued. I'm kind of a pack rat and closet historian of presidential campaigns, so I have all of them back to when climate wasn't even an issue in a file cabinet somewhere, if anybody wants to read them. So I think there is a strengthening resolve here. I think that's true in the developed world. I am very worried about the developing world, and especially the global slowdown in response to the pandemic, because in the emerging economies, economic growth is difficult. Capital is scarce. We don't have the ability to scale these solutions. And because of that, number one, on a global level, we need even more attention on the emerging market energy challenges than we do for the US. I believe we will only get that if we, as Martin Luther King said, clean our own house first. I think we can only get the rest of the world and the emerging markets to come along with us if we, number one, clean our own house first, which is, after all, right now in this economic collapse, it's very much in our economic interest anyway. But we will also, that leadership will, first of all, give us export opportunities to those markets and make it an even better opportunity here. And second of all, it will give us some of the moral leadership we need to, and the resources we need to help them. So the emerging markets are very, very important. They are making substantial progress. Again, I would not have predicted as much 10 years ago, but they're lagging far behind, and they don't have the ability that we genuinely have in this country, that where within a matter of decades, we could completely decarbonize our grid and almost completely decarbonize our energy system.
Well, that was a great question, Dave, and what a great thought to clean our own house first. Peter, this was a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for joining us. Really, really enjoyed it. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining. Thank you.
Thanks everybody. Have a good day. Stay safe.